Okay, well, in the interest of time, we will get cracking. More will join us as we go. Well, hello and a very warm welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar discussing how to deliver clean energy and the investments in transition metal supply chains that is required. I'm Ian Welsh, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. As demand for critical minerals surges due to accelerating clean energy initiatives, the landscape is becoming increasingly complex. Current and looming supply gaps are emerging alongside shifting political dynamics that are pivotal to the climate transition. So there's lots to talk about, and to help frame our discussion, we have an expert panel. We have Anna Fleming from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence, we have Caroline Avan from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, and Jonathan Horrell from the Weir Group. Now, I'll turn to our panel very shortly, but we do want to hear from you all. Please be thinking about your points and questions that you'd like me to put to our panel and write them into the Q&A box on your Zoom window. Please note your name and organisation when putting your question. You can, of course, like others' questions by clicking the thumbs up, and the more likes a question has, the greater chances that I will put it to the panel. I should say that the issues that we've been talking about that we will be talking about today will be very much part of the conversations at the Critical Minerals Innovation Forum on 5th and 6th of November. There are more details on the Innovation Forum website. If this is of interest, then please email my colleague, Amelia Coleman, email address in the chat box. Okay, we are going to be recording the webinar today, so we'll share the links to audio and video in the next few days. Okay, let's get cracking. Anna, welcome. Can you outline for us the role of transition metals in net zero goals? Anna.
Hi, Ian. Hi, everybody. And thanks so much to the Innovation Forum for inviting us to speak today. So in terms of the role of transition minerals in net zero goals, I think the best place to start is that meeting net zero goals really depends heavily on the implementation and the build out of low carbon technologies. And when I say technologies in this sense, I mean both systems infrastructure, so solar plants, wind farms, energy storage grids, and the cabling that connects everything. And I also mean technologies that are more personal and visible to a lot of us in our day-to-day lives, such as electric vehicles, which is kind of the main common discussed end use. Now, many of the components of these technologies are built from metals that we derive from natural resources that we need to mine. In most cases, actually all cases, these metals had a purpose before the energy transition. They had a purpose in various other industries, but now their purpose is really intensified. It's under the spotlight, and they're needed in much greater volumes than they ever have before. So over recent years, we've seen demand for these transition metals, if we want to call them that. Lots talk about lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, copper. They're needed in much greater volumes now than ever before, and that's already underway and it's forecast out going forwards as well. And so this is also why you see this designation of some minerals as critical, as energy transition metals, a really appropriate word in some senses, because in a lot of these new technologies that I've mentioned, they're incredibly reliant on these metals. So often these metals are non-fungible. That means they can't be replaced by anything else in a lot of their end uses. Now, scientists are continuously searching for alternatives, competitors, better, more economic, more sustainable ways of doing things. And for sure, there will be some evolutions, but as it stands at the moment, the technologies that I mentioned and the metals that we're talking about today have been scaling and are front running as these clean tech solutions to help support our net zero goals.
Thanks, Anna. You're talking about the demands for different metals changing. Can you give us an idea of which metals are in more in demand and the sort of scale of that demand?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, understandably, given the context, demand expectations are shifting and intensifying. And by and large, that means a shooting upwards of the demand curves. Now, one bird's eye data point that I think can be really useful in terms of scale is that across 9 of the most crucial metals for the net zero transition is that we might need around 300 new mines by 2030. So, and that's, that scale depending on the size of the typical mine and that raw material, but kind of gives you a sense of the scale of the challenge, if you will. Now, if we want to dive a bit deeper into some of the more commonly discussed commodities, we would forecast that annual global lithium production will need to double within the next 5 or so years, and consider that in the last 10 years or so, there's already been a huge uplift in demand. But so that's another doubling from today to 5 or so years' time. If we talk about like cobalt or nickel, we'd be looking for a doubling in around 10 years' time versus what we produce today. On the other hand, some of the other products, like copper, already have, a wide range of uses already mined as a bulk commodity in huge volumes. Now, the clean tech share of demand will be a bit smaller, the impact, but because it's such a large market, even if you're talking about a 30% share of clean tech in demand for that commodity, it's still huge on volume terms, basically. So huge changes abound for a lot of these products. Now, I think we have the demand shifts, and what we also see is that really links into a shift in the way that these markets for metals work and the landscape altogether. This isn't happening in silo to the people who work on these commodities. With increased demand, you have an injection of new influence. You have new market participation, both new end users and new suppliers. You have new stakeholders. We're all stakeholders in making sure that this is possible and that it's done in the right way. And it's also ultimately economic opportunity that understandably many want to seize, and also opportunity to grow mineral production in a sustainable way as well.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. Thanks for that. Lots to come back on that but let's bring in Jonathan and Carolyn. Carolyn, can you perhaps comment on the need for mining to scale up with as little impact as possible in terms of social impacts?
Thanks, Ian, and thanks for having us. So I work for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. So we are a human rights organization dedicated to advancing human rights in global business operations. And so one of the questions we've been trying to answer in the past couple of years is looking at the impact of rising global demand for transition minerals, as was mentioned, on human rights. And so collecting stories and examples of things that are not going so well today in the extraction of transition minerals, and how this could have impact on supply chains of transition minerals. So we've been working on developing a global database of issues, allegations of human rights abuses in the context of the extraction of 7 minerals that are key for the energy transition: bauxite, cobalt, copper, lithium, manganese, nickel, and zinc. And this year we're going to add iron ore, looking at information on allegations of abuses that have been happening in the context of large-scale mining operations, so across all geographies, across all types of companies, and no matter where they are headquartered. And so today we have 630 cases of allegations of abuses in our database. And I just want to just take you through what we see from the data that we have collected, and the type of cases and issues, and where there's a need to clean up the extraction of transition minerals. We see that the impact of those mining operations are highly multifaceted. We have a significant number of allegations that are associated with impact on local communities and also on the local environment. And so two frequent patterns that we see starts with environmental violation, particularly water and soil pollution, and that is then compounded by limited or absent consultations with local residents and issues around consent of indigenous peoples in particular, leading to protracted conflict around certain mining projects. We also have a number of cases that involve labor rights abuses, lots of issues around occupational health safety at certain mines, including work-related death. And also, finally, but that's actually related to the first point that I mentioned, lots of cases of attacks against human rights defenders when they are speaking out in contexts where civic freedoms are repressed and when there is a limited civic space to talk about the issues that their communities are facing. So that's what we know from the data that we have collected. We also, what we see at the moment is that this increase in global demand of transition minerals is likely to breed, and so those type of impacts is likely to breed more conflict with local communities. and litigation. We have documented 40 cases of litigation brought by local communities, by indigenous peoples and defenders against mining companies since 2011, and a number of mining projects that have been stopped as a result of litigation. Just to name a few, the Cobre Panama copper mine in Panama was put to an end temporarily last year. Phoenix nickel mine in Guatemala, and also numerous cases of environmental authorizations that have been suspended. I will just finish by that's how we see the case for cleaning up transition mineral supply chain. There's more case, human rights need to be respected, but also this is clearly breeding conflicts around mining sites, and we don't see sufficient corporate policies being in place at a company level to respond to those issues.
Okay, thank you. Again, lots to come back on there, but thank you very much indeed. Jonathan, let me ask you a similar question, but thinking more in terms of the environmental impact. How can the sector, what are the challenges for the sector in terms of scaling up with as little environmental impact as possible?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So Weir was established in Glasgow just over 150 years ago. It's now a member of the UK FTSE 100 with operations around the world and revenue of around 2.5 billion. We're a technology provider to the mining sector. So we make large and increasingly digitally enabled machines that are used by miners in their operations. Now, if you look at our customer profile, our biggest demand is from copper mines. About a quarter of our revenue comes from there. And if you add iron ore, gold, and battery metals, it takes that to around half of our business. We have a smaller proportion of revenue, just over 10% from fossil fuels, which comprises thermal and steelmaking coal, as well as some oil. So we have a strong commercial interest in the clean energy transition, and we have assessed its impact, therefore, under various different transition scenarios. So if you look at it from a business as usual scenario, if governments around the world implement current policies, the balance of demand for our products and services from miners of copper, lithium, and nickel, the transition metals, compared with miners of iron ore and fossil fuels, is very slightly negative at around a sort of 50 million pounds a year annual net revenue impact by 2033. But under a faster 1.5 degree centigrade aligned energy transition, this balance moves in our favour because of faster growth in copper and battery metals to around 100 million pounds a year net annual revenue gain by 2033. So a faster energy transition is therefore good for Weir. And if you want to look this up, it's all in our TCFD reporting, in our annual report, which came out last week. Now, the paradox, of course, of mining being critical for a clean energy future is that mining is itself a high impact sector. And I'll say more in a moment about some of the detail, but overall, as mining scales up to meet demand from clean energy for copper and other metals, as well as echoing, obviously, Caroline's comments about the need to respect people's rights, we see a big opportunity for miners to adopt best available technology to reduce the impact of mining on the environment, in particular in the light of that challenge that Anna described, to open as many as 300 new mines in the coming years. And so our sustainability strategy is based around two big themes. Obviously, we talk about Deliver Sustainable Weir, which is focused internally on our own people, our own operations, ways of working, and that's to minimize our direct impact. But critically also, we talk Accelerate Sustainable Mining, which recognizes that the biggest impacts occur downstream while our equipment is being used on mines. And so it focuses externally on solving our customers' biggest sustainability challenges and quantifying the impact of that to help them to scale up with as little impact as possible.
Thank you, Jonathan. Fascinating. Thanks so much for our first question. We need some more. So please do be thinking about your questions and put them in the Q&A box as we go, and I'll bring them to our panelists a little bit later on. Okay, Anna, in terms of where the supply gaps are going to be, where do you think there's going to be, or are there developing gaps in demand or requirements for transition metals?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So I think at the global level, we see supply gaps in lithium before the end of this decade, which is really very soon. For nickel and cobalt, we see that further out in like the early 2030s. So that's where we would see there being a gap between that projected demand line and the estimated supply line as well, based on the projects that we can see forthcoming. Now, I want to be a little bit more nuanced and say, you know, it's not just a case of that we don't have any more known locations of these minerals. It's not a case of there's no more resources in the ground, or we're not kind of searching, no one's searching for the last ton available or anything like that. So sometimes it sounds graver than it is, but in fact, in some of these markets, if there were no complexities to commissioning mine sites, then our total possible supply database probably wouldn't look that bad against demand forecast over the next, like, say, 15, 20 years. And that's because already there's been a huge amount of investment, a huge amount of prospecting to look for these metals that we have known for some time are going to be so critical to the energy transition. But going back to what I said about complexities commissioning a mine site, in reality, it's really quite complicated to commission a mine. A huge amount of investment is required, so there's a big challenge raising financing. Plus, there are also, quite rightly, lengthy permitting processes as well. So there really has to be a strong business case. A lot of checks and balances need to go into it as well. So it's not a case of, you know, find a resource and then put a mine there at all. You know, it's far more complicated than that, and it should be more complicated than that. So that's potentially where we also see this gap. Sometimes it's more of like an investment gap and a implementing best practices gap, if you will, in terms of timing. Also, in terms of where supply gaps are likely to be, you know, I've kind of been speaking about demand in the global sense and supply in the global sense. With the current geopolitical climate, the days of global supply equals global demand across all parts of the supply chain are gone. You know, the world doesn't work like that. I think that's really evident for everybody to see. And so all the global powers are increasingly wanting to base their downstream industries at home, and also in doing so are looking to secure access to critical minerals at home if they have the resources. That's so-called onshoring, or through partnerships and collaboration with allies, which is often referred to as friendshoring, where you'd have a partnership, formal or informal, to source these metals from countries that are friendly. And so then this is where we're seeing a lot of shakeup as well in terms of that supply gap. We're seeing some jurisdictions using various push and pull policy tools to drive investment to where they want to see the mines and industry setting up. And this has knock-on implications like across the supply chain and whether this sourcing strategies can be achieved or not.
Thank you. Could you just give us a little bit more on the sorts of challenges there are around getting mines up and running? What are the particular challenges that mining companies that inevitably encounter?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's quite a long road to establishing whether extracting from this site is economically viable. I mean, it's one thing to have a resource; it's another thing to have that economically viable extractable. So there's a lot of work and research that needs to go into that. There's of course all the aforementioned work into securing permits. And kind of establishing with all the stakeholders that that permit to mine, and as Caroline was alluding to, that can be a critical part in the process where things start to go wrong if that's not done properly or according to best practices. And you maybe have like a perfect project on paper, let's say, and you've got the buy-in of all the stakeholders, and you might be able to achieve permitting. I mean, in reality, these things happen in parallel, but then you also need to raise a huge amount of money in most cases to be able to start that mine. And things get complicated. Commercial banks can't always cover the risks of some mining projects. There's obviously different funding sources to tap into, and that's why we also increasingly see government stepping in with loans or kind of different financing tools and solutions. But yeah, those are kind of the two broad buckets, and then there's a lot of nuances in amongst that, and also in amongst that, you're trying to, work on the technical side, which, I'm sure Jonathan knows so much more about, but you need to kind of be establishing a mine plan. You need to be putting in everything to make this a viable project from the technological standpoint as well. So yeah, that's the overview. I think one thing that I noticed today, the EU just kind of came out with a new list of projects that it's deemed high priority. And it said on that the goal will be for the permitting process to not exceed, and it was like over 2 years. So it was kind of like 25 or 26 months. Sorry, don't have the exact number, but that gives you an idea. Like even in the best case scenario, when we're trying our hardest from the policy standpoint to help this mining project make it through all the kind of all the process of permitting, that it's still 2 years or so. So that's incredibly best case scenario. Projects often take 15 to 20 years to materialize as well.
Wow, gosh, long time, for sure. Do you have any thoughts on the impact of EVs and their batteries on all of this? Oh, Anna, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks. So in short, the impact of EVs is huge. When we break down battery demand into the different subsectors, it's EVs that comes out dominant. Now, we shouldn't overlook energy system storage as well, battery storage. That's also having an increasingly big role, but portables, your mobile phone, handheld devices are shrinking into almost nothing in comparison to the growth that we're seeing in EVs and BESS. But again, it's much more nuanced than that, because as we see more of these batteries entering the market, that means that at the end of life of these batteries, there's more opportunity for recycling as well. And that can be a future potential source of metal supply that doesn't need to be mined. So that's one other aspect. A second aspect to this is that, as we discussed before, technology doesn't stand still. And when it comes to batteries, the cathode chemistry in particular, which is the mix of metals that you use to prepare the cathode, varies. And all relates back to the EV and consumer expectations. If you want a long-range vehicle, a premium vehicle, we have different chemistries for different applications. So it's not as straightforward as like, this is the one chemistry to make a battery. It's much more complicated than that. And so that means that disruptive technologies can arrive, and that might implicate a different demand for a different product or commodity. But it also means that nothing is set in stone. The plans of the automakers are changing all the time, and forecast demand is evolving too. So I suppose what I'm all really trying to say in summary is that there is a huge implication from EVs, the decisions that the automakers make, the cathode chemistries that are available and that are commercialized and scaled. There's a whole bunch of different risks and opportunities running along side by side.
Great, thanks very much. Jonathan, let's talk a bit about decarbonisation in the sector. What are the principal challenges in terms of decarbonisation for mining operations?
Well, so if you look at the mining process, it tends to break down into three main stages. The first, rock is extracted and then moved to be processed. This is often at huge scale using these large diggers and haul trucks that we're familiar with from pictures. This uses around half of the energy consumed by mining. Much of that is used in the form of diesel. Many miners are working on solutions to reduce diesel use through electrification or hydrogen-powered haul trucks, for example. Now, we don't manufacture diggers and trucks ourselves, so we're not directly involved in this, but we do provide AI-powered imaging equipment to help miners to manage these operations more efficiently. The second main stage is where we supply equipment for a process known as comminution. These are words you learn when you join a sector like this. Comminution means crushing rocks to a very fine powder to liberate the mineral that they contain. You have to get it from the size of a meter across, maybe down to a size that's measured in microns. Now, globally, it's estimated that this process consumes around 3% of the world's primary energy. It's a very energy-intensive process, but it's traditionally done in a way that's inefficient. And so by adopting modern technology, we can improve energy efficiency by as much as 40% and avoid up to 50% of carbon emissions. And we've quantified this using the WBCSD's avoided emissions guidance and published data on our website that you can read. And finally, mining creates waste, often in the form of rock mixed with water, known as tailings. Now, this consumes obviously and binds up a lot of water in non-productive purpose, takes it away from the local environment, and it creates potential risk for communities and the environment around that. So again, we're working on flow sheets to process tailings to reduce in ways to reduce water consumption, improve water recovery, improve stability and safety of tailings facilities, and where feasible to repurpose waste. To help accelerate these trends, of course, we've actually now designed our enterprise technology roadmap around key themes. So we call them moving less rock, use less energy, use water wisely, create less waste. Digitization is also a big enabler. And through acquisitions like of two AI businesses, I've mentioned one, Motion Metrics, another called Sentient AI, and a recent agreement to buy a mining software provider, Micromine, we've built our capability further to help customers address sustainability challenges. So essentially, we've now geared our technology strategy towards precisely these topics. And it's the kind of thing, if you think about 15 years to gain regulatory approval, a permit to open a mine, then it's going to have been designed with 10 to 15 years ago's technology to operate it. If you can shorten that process, and partly by showing that you do have opportunities to decarbonize, then clearly you can bring this technology to life sooner.
Okay, thank you. Can you tell us a bit more then about what best practice energy strategy needs to look like for the sector?
Well, this is an interesting one because it's outside the control directly, probably of the mining sector itself, never mind us. But I would say that energy consumption by mining appears in our Scope 3 footprint, which is dominated by that. So mining uses a lot of energy, as we discussed, sometimes at a kind of level that can have significant impact on demand at national level in some of the countries where mines operate. And it's often in remote and underserved communities as well. So both miners and their surrounding communities need access to secure energy supplies via resilient infrastructure. And there is, of course, a huge scope to decarbonize. So I suppose what a great opportunity it would be to see more collaboration between mining sector, the energy sector, communities and governments to plot a path to scale, if you like, for secure supplies of low carbon power in key energy transition mining geographies, so that we could then fuel the clean energy transition with cleaner minerals.
Great, thanks very much, Jonathan. Again, lots to come back. More questions, please. We have a few, which we'll be turning to very shortly, but please do be thinking about questions and sticking them into the Q&A box, and we'll come to them very shortly. Carolyn, I wonder if I can ask you to think about what sort of innovation and innovative approaches you want to see to develop more responsible sourcing going forwards.
Thanks. Look, from our perspective, which is the perspective of a human rights organization, what we see at the moment is that this is an opportunity to build new approaches that really center corporate duty of care and respect for human rights, fair negotiations with communities, with indigenous peoples, and shared prosperity as well, with local communities who are impacted by those new mining developments, and combine those approaches into a new type of investment approaches and mining developments. But that will take innovation, political and innovation in political and governance approaches to really depart from sort of like the business as usual and looking beyond compliance, while still being compliant, of course, with the necessary regulations in the sector, but also away from easy solutions and like sort of like tick the box approaches in terms of especially looking at engagement with local communities. The other thing as well, so that I want to mention is that in terms of innovative thinking, is we also need to think that the silver bullet to the energy transition is not necessarily more mining at the moment. We do need a lot of minerals in the energy transition. We also know that a lot of minerals that are being extracted are not being used in the energy transition. So there has to be also a discussion that is led by states around decision to mine and question on final usage of minerals when it's for the energy transition or when it's for something else, because there is real societal expectation there. So like I said, we do need minerals in the energy transition, but we need to think that we don't need them at all costs. This is extremely short-sighted. Evidence and research, including our own, show that fast-tracking, accelerating public permitting is not going to actually fast-track projects. It's going to lead to more conflict on the ground, which eventually is going to slow down and derail projects. So there is like extreme caution that needs to happen there. So just a few words on like the type of new approaches that we want to see from states. We need strong from all actors. We need strong states, and we need them to look at how civic freedoms are being respected and protected in their country, how people are free to speak about the impact of the mine, and how we can avoid using the discussion on minerals to support another political agenda. We also need to see the conditions for real dialogue where rights holders have an opportunity to weigh in on final outcomes. And we also need to see more information being provided, not only about what is a mine open for, but also on contracts, on annexes, on impact assessments for mining projects. A lot is already available in some countries, but not everywhere. And we need to see an expansion of the informational scope. We also need to see companies taking an approach, like I said, that is beyond compliance. We see too many companies in the supply chains of minerals are still approaching this from a conflict minerals perspective only. There are risks that are associated with minerals outside of the free TG. So you need to have a due diligence approach that is not only focused on free TG. We don't see enough companies doing that. Like I'm talking about end users of minerals and having this sort of like entire value chain due diligence perspective. And we also need to see private sector voices calling for responsible mineral supply chains. We see a growing number of investors doing that. We need to see more of them calling for conditions for responsible extraction at mining site. And of course, last but not least, we need to see better global cooperation and another type of use of multilateral spaces, because this global competition to extract more minerals in the energy transition, which are needed, but this lack of global cooperation is going to drive further resistance, repression in certain contexts. We know that there are many, many countries today where we are seeing a very worrying erosion of civic freedoms. So we do need to see more collaboration and cooperation at the international level. And I will stop there, but there's also no need to reinvent the wheel in terms of political innovation. Basic tenets of respect for human rights are also not in place in many spaces, and the text and the standards have been there for, like a number of decades. So we need to see, we also need to keep holding the bar high on standards for responsible business conduct that have been in existence for the past 20 years.
Thank you very much. I wondered what concerns you have around the current apparent sort of dash for mineral grabbing, the sort of the kind of potential for conflict resolution that's involving sticking flags into mineral deposits. What are you seeing in terms of the potential for human rights risks there?
Like I said, like any development in the mining sector that doesn't take into consideration the fact that there is societal expectation across the globe on information on how minerals extracted today, what are they going to be used for, is likely to backfire. And so like a conflict resolution that is centered on a mineral deal, but is only to answer an agenda that is focused around securing access to minerals. And again, like I do understand that those supply chains are needed, but if it doesn't take into consideration the bigger picture out there, it's likely to be resisted in many circumstances.
Okay, thanks so much. Let's turn to some audience questions. Thanks for those of you that have posed questions. It's time for plenty more, so please do be thinking about further points and put them into the Q&A box. touched on this already, but we have a question asking about the role of circularity and recycling playing in filling supply gaps in these critical minerals. Anna, any thoughts on, in particular, what the how far circularity and recycling can play a role here?
Yeah, so I think in the data and models that we've been running on recycling and looking at the different recycling technologies that are out there, which is a really exciting field, to be honest. We definitely see that recycling can and most likely will play a really significant role. To give a bit of a data point on scale, I think in terms of lithium could be around 35% of supply in the next like 10 to 15 years. We're talking in like the tens of percentages of supply, and actually even greater for some of the other materials that are easier to recycle as well, from the cathodes specifically. Of course, recycling's not new, and we've been recycling a lot of other metals for a long time now. But as with the increased scrutiny and attention to critical minerals, then it's similar for recycling of these. So definitely on an impact basis, I think it's there. We need to see more of a cycle of these batteries reaching end of life. Because hopefully, as much as possible, the batteries do last a really long time and have a long lifespan. And then it's just about kind of getting them back into the system. But there's a lot of capacity out there already started up, looking to start up in terms of recycling. So the potential is there. In terms of reducing environmental and social impact, that's not a given. In comparison to mining, there's still an environmental impact to a recycling facility. We see lots of work around doing life cycle assessments, LCAs, of recycling facilities, so that we can like truly try to understand the environmental impact of recycling and kind of compare it, if you will, to primary extraction. And similarly on social impact, so site dependent, and kind of so like nuanced to the commodity as well. But I suppose the one benefit of a recycling facility is that within a wider context, you can choose where to place it. Whereas when there's a mine site that is in a controversial location, that has to be worked through and properly assessed. Whereas there's a bit more to play with, I suppose, on the social aspect when potentially placing a recycling facility. So yeah, the opportunity is definitely there, but whether it can definitely reduce environmental and social impact, it's more nuanced than that, and will depend on a case by case.
Thanks, Anna. Carolyn, do you want to comment on the social impacts? You mentioned this in your remarks earlier.
No, I mean, I don't have much to add to this point. I think it has potential to reduce, of course, the environmental impact of new extraction of minerals. So it's absolutely crucial to have sufficient recycling. But again, I think it's about like having a balanced approach to the extraction of virgin minerals and what is it used for. And it's we all know that it's not going to be the case that we can recycle 100%. Obviously, but then it's about having the right type of standards in place for recycling facilities as well.
And I guess there's an element of designing for recyclability, which is very important as well when the individual components are being created. Thank you. Jonathan, I wonder if I could ask you, with a question looking at technology that can help cleaner extraction of minerals. How much is this something that the Weir Group is involved in?
Well, I think it's essentially where we see the future, because actually it's, from our perspective and from a miner's perspective as well, ultimately in the economic interest as well. The cleaner extraction of minerals generally involves more efficient use of resources, whether that's energy, water, or the creation of waste, containment of pollution, and so on. And generally speaking, if you extract more efficiently, you make more money at it, but also you reduce the impact. So it's one of those rare cases, whereas from a perspective of a technology provider, it makes sense that the more sustainable option tends to be the better, the easier option, the more rational, if you like, simpler business option as well. So technology innovation has a huge potential. I talked about 40% step change opportunities in that comminution process of crushing rocks. That's something that is now established through use of a particular type of technology that we refer to as HPGR, and it's starting to scale. And therefore, I think we're starting to see an opportunity that as expansion, greenfields, but also brownfield expansions start to come through to meet demand. They could be done on a significantly cleaner basis. But there are other opportunities, maybe not that big, but there are other opportunities through the process as well to reduce impacts on energy and also very significantly water.
Yes, our questioner talks about technology extracting lithium in Argentina, and there has been, our questioner said, controversy around how efficient they are with the use of water. How much of your focus is developing more water efficient processes?
I think you find less of our businesses with that type of lithium extraction, though lithium is also most of our businesses in so-called hard rock mining, where you dig it up. That's the lithium extraction you described there is a different process, but it doesn't matter. Water is an incredibly salient issue across mining. If you look at somewhere, if in that same region, if you look at other forms of mining in to the west side of the Andes, if you like, much of the Chilean copper industry is water constrained, and therefore supply of sufficient water to operate the mine is something which is a huge engineering challenge. It requires pumping water from sea level, say, up to the high Andes, and so it's a massive cost burden. But also, of course, it's an impact on environments. If you're extracting water from the environment, then it means you're taking it from potentially another purpose. And miners face real constraints through permitting, and we understand the processes aren't perfect, but there are real constraints on miners' ability to operate on this, and therefore they need to manage it in different ways. And the challenges where water is scarce are different from where water is abundant, for example, as well. So technology needs to be very much sensitive to the environment in which it's operating. But measurement and quantification of impact and use of technology can be brought to bear to make a real difference.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really interesting question, looking at unintended consequences of mining expansion. Our questioner asks, what are the implications for biodiversity and land use related CO2 emissions from an expansion of mining? And I guess the question is, does that then, how do you offset that against the benefits from the transition metals in terms of accelerating the transition to zero carbon energy sources? And is that something that you guys look at in terms of the balancing the CO2 impact of the extra mining required to create the minerals that can lead to electrification of energy?
Yeah, sure. So what we look at in our sustainability department often is the differences between different processes that are commonplace for the different materials. So for example, in nickel or in lithium or any of these products, there's not necessarily one process route, right? So there's a lot of different process routes and a lot of different decision points that can influence the carbon intensity of the process as well. The implications for that on biodiversity, again, typically look at through the lens of the life cycle assessment, which can have biodiversity factors looked at it within it. And yeah, I mean, I can only kind of agree with the sentiment that in the instances where there is the extreme implications that we try to meet these in other ways, that we assess and compare the different process routes. I think one thing that I'll maybe add to the conversation is that I think particularly when it comes to the battery industry, the downstream, so the OEMs, the cell producers, they are aware and sensitive, and many of them are factoring in to a certain degree all of these metrics about the places that they are sourcing from. It's obviously not consistent across the board. It really does vary, but what we see in a lot of our work, that there is in some instances a requirement to meet a lot of prerequisites before you're even at the discussion table of supplying to some of these OEMs. Now, the challenge in amongst that in a world where we see supply gaps is that, you know, it kind of just shifts around who has what material potentially. So that doesn't necessarily raise the bar for everyone, but it is a good signal, I guess, coming out from the downstream that hopes to kind of, you know, act as another lever, let's say, to ensuring that we shepherd this in the right way possible.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. We have a question asking about how the environmental impacts change from mineral to mineral. Mining lithium versus copper, for example. Jonathan, is that something that you take account of when you're thinking about this sort of thing at Weir Group?
Yes, though I think it's probably better to think about it in terms of how the impacts vary from place to place. So it's not necessarily the mineral itself that drives the difference. But for example, if we think about water balance, one side of the Andes to the other, you've got abundance in Brazil, and that leads to challenges of its own. You've got shortage in Chile, which leads to different sets of challenges, all of which can be environmental, and also they can have huge impacts on people in surrounding areas as well. So I think it's a place-based question more than if like an ore-based system question. But that's something that the technology that is brought to bear needs to manage. I think in all cases, if you're using less water in the process, and that's one of the big opportunities that there could be in the future. You are therefore exposing less water to risk of pollution, and you're therefore creating less risk on the surrounding environment. And then in some places where water is scarce, you also have this question about the impact on overall water balance and what that's doing to the surrounding ecosystem. So, water is a very common factor in this. I think in almost all cases with mining, you need to there is a strong interest to reduce energy consumption. One point about land use is that mining is quite a long-term industry. If you take a 20-year lifespan for a facility, it will be opened up. There will be a big hole in the ground, very typically. At the end of life, then there should be restoration, and increasingly you're seeing those kind of commitments coming back to restore landscapes at some level once the mining has completed. And therefore, it's not necessarily just a once-only change. It's also very important about how that transition is managed at the end.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Carolyn, do you want to comment on how the social impacts vary between, I mean, do you think of it in terms of the mineral to mineral, or is it, as Jonathan says, more of a concern around where the mining facility is located?
No, I very much agree with Jonathan's, right. It's rather place-based than mineral based. Obviously, like this is, like we know that there are mines in countries where not only there are limited civic freedoms, but they are actually being like further limited at the moment, and that is what is going to drive the type of issues we're going to see. We also know that there are countries with limited or weakly enforced as well governance rules, and some of them are not necessarily too far from Europe, and that also creates conditions for a lack of meaningful engagement with communities, and also situations in which defenders will not be allowed to freely express their concerns, which again is often a driver of conflict. So it's rather dependent on the legal institutional sort of framework as opposed to being associated with one mineral or another.
Thanks very much. We have a question on forced labor. clearly a major concern. Caroline, I'll come to you in a sec. But Anna, do you monitor forced labour issues in mining in particular? Our questioner talks about in a particular concern for artisanal miners. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, so we aren't necessarily tracking this on a like site by site basis, let's say. But of course we're monitoring as an incredibly important topic. What we do in some of our work is look at the disclosures and the transparency that is coming out of the companies that are operating at these critical mineral sites. But again, I think that's only, that's just one layer. That's kind of whether they're acknowledging, discussing, and properly engaging with the topic. I think as an incredibly sensitive topic, it's important that it comes back to consultation, comes back to stakeholders, and that it comes back to policy interventions that don't exacerbate any of the kind of negative consequences. But at the same time, it's not going to be for, it's not going to be for one party to kind of determine, how artisanal mining or kind of plays out, let's say. So yeah, it's something that we monitor at the transparency level, but I can't say we look at it deep at the site level.
And in terms of investment, or sort of investor approach to this, is this something that investors are very, ask lots of questions about?
Yeah, I think it is a topic that's asked a lot of questions about. I think it's a topic that a lot of people have a formed view on based on what they will read in newspapers. Some of which can be extremely accurate, but some of which can be misleading when, kind of when it comes down to it. Sometimes there's a bit too much of a broad brush approach, particularly in terms of cobalt. Some of which is very due, and it brings due attention. We need that attention brought to these challenges so that then there can be like multi-stakeholder solutions found. But at the same time, there is a lot of I guess, education required around this topic and a number of other topics as, the investment community widens for these critical minerals. Yeah, it can certainly be a conversation that we need to have, but isn't, yeah, I guess it's more delicate of a subject than we are specifically leading on, let's say.
Sure. Well, thanks, Anna. Caroline, do you want to comment on particularly the forced labour concerns for artisanal mines?
Thanks. I mean, we don't exactly track ASM, like we actually specialize on looking at large scale mining activities, but obviously the question of forced labor is something that comes up also in our research. There are also cases of allegations in the context of large scale mining activities, but it's only a handful of cases that we have at this point, again, in the context of large scale mining operations. Obviously, it's different in ASM, but the point here for me is actually, echoing what Anna just said. There has been a lot of attention on forced labor in ASM, child labor as well. And, I'm not going to say that this is not important. It's incredibly important. And I think the work of, global civil society on this has been really key to change some of the practices in the sector. But those are not the only things that are happening, unfortunately, in the mining sector. It sort of obscures and takes away international attention from other issues as well. So again, incredibly important, but that's not the only problem, unfortunately. To finish that, as I mentioned, what we know is that the mining sector remains quite dangerous for its workers. What we do know is that there is a lot of issues at certain mining sites with occupational health, safety, hazards, and work-related accidents, as well as a lack of sufficient protection of collective rights of workers. There are many places in the world where workers do not have the right to collectively bargain, and that has obviously an impact on their working conditions. So also just take like a bigger approach to those issues. And again, it's very context dependent, but companies can do more than just following national regulations here.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, do you want to comment on the the impact of the use of AI in this sector and how that's helping to supply, help plug supply gaps?
Looking at the AI question, I think there are always different ways that you can address the issue of AI. From our perspective, and I mentioned we've made a couple of acquisitions of AI-based technology companies recently. AI can be used to optimize, to help improve efficiency in process flows, and therefore, as a tool, it can be enormously powerful and useful. There's a broader question about the wider adoption of AI and the way that's a driver of energy consumption. And so again, you've got as usual a trade-off, and you've got something with significant benefits attached to it potentially, which also has impacts that need to be managed. So yeah, I think it's here to stay. It's going to grow. It's something that we're going to need to manage. But from our perspective, at least, within the operation of our technology, it's something that can be a very useful tool.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to put a question to you, Carolyn, and it's around communities engaging. What strategies, our question asks, can affected communities adopt to engage with mining companies, and are there strategies that have worked? It's quite a big question. Could you give a brief answer? We're coming close to our time.
Yeah, I will try to be brief, but it's such a big question. But yes, I think affected communities need to be clear on what they are asking companies. I usually ask the question like the other way around: what companies should do to avoid tick the box exercise. So there's plenty of literature on how to conduct meaningful engagement, but just to say, two things or maybe three things on this, like what is meaningful engagement with local communities, and what is it that communities basically should be asking for, is that it's safe, but it's inclusive. That sounds pretty basic, but it's not always the case. Not always because of a company's fault, but because of how things are happening in a certain place. So ask for safe and inclusive dialogue. It needs to be happening. A dialogue needs to be happening when all options are still on the table. So it's not only about informing or consulting with communities, it's about having an impact on the final outcome of a particular decision. And so whether it means revisiting the planning process for the mine, that needs to be on the table. And the final thing is to ask companies what sort of policies they have in place that support that engagement. So it's not only like coming and having a discussion on any day. It's about having the internal policy and processes from a due diligence perspective, and need to be in place to really demonstrate how, in the long term, human rights and local communities will be respected.
Okay, thank you very much. Brilliant answer, and concise as well. Thanks very much indeed. And I've got one more question I want to put to you, Anna, and then I'm going to ask our panel to give us their taking away from the session. Anna, how necessary is deep sea mining in plugging critical mineral supply gaps, do you think, and now and going forwards?
Sure. So, yeah, I guess the emphasis is on the word necessary here, perhaps. As with other proposed mine sites, there are projects on the table at the moment, and these are being looked at critically by policymakers and given due attention from civil society as well. I think in terms of like on a volume to volume basis, we don't see at the moment these projects as being the ones that need to be commissioned. Let's put it that way. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we do have long lists of potential sources of supply for the minerals that we're talking about. We also have the incoming injection of recycling that we also discussed. And I suppose leaning on Caroline's point before about justification before starting any mining project, and kind of comparing it to alternatives potentially, I think we need to be looking at deep sea mining in that context. And I think, the kind of global ecosystem around deep sea mining is certainly doing that. But on a like pure volume basis, let's say, there's supply there, but we have other resources that we need to look at critically as well, and examine them all across all the factors that we've been discussing today, environmental, social, and have the relevant experts like chiming in on that as well.
Okay, thanks very much. We're coming towards the end of our time. I'd like to ask our panel just to give us one final thought, what the key point they've picked up from the conversation in the last hour. Jonathan, you first, please, briefly, if you would.
Final thought is that we're going to need to move to a system, a circular system that uses minerals better, but it's going to need more minerals in it to function effectively. So there is going to be a period of transition here. I think the emphasis is on transition to get to a clean economy, and minerals will play a big role.
So a mineral transition then. Caroline.
We do need to see innovative approaches in the way that we talk to each other, the mining industry, with civil society, with local communities, and all actors, including investors, to approach supply chains of mineral, not only from a supply perspective, but also from a geopolitical and global governance perspective.
Thanks very much. And Anna.
Yeah, I would say that the challenge is big and the supply gaps are there, but every time I'm part of these conversations, I feel inspired that we have relevant experts across all the relevant areas and all the topics that we need to be concerned with. So from my perspective, it's really about pooling this expertise and spreading it and raising the bar.
Great, thanks so much indeed. Well, we are out of time. Many thanks to our panel for their times and insight today, and to you all for your questions. Now, as I said earlier, the issues that we'll be talking will be very much part of the conversations at our Critical Minerals Innovation Forum on the 5th and 6th of November. More details on the Innovation Forum website, and do email Amelia Coleman if you'd like more information in particular. Email address in the chat. We'll be in touch in the next few days with the recordings of the webinar, so keep a lookout for those. For now, though, I hope you found the last hour to be useful. I've been Ian Welsh. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.